Well, welcome everyone. I'm Dr. Josh with Digital Hammurabi, and we are very excited today to have Dr. Maggie Bryson with us. And hopefully, she won't be too upset with her if I call her Dr. Bryson. I've known Maggie now for a while, but it's lovely to have you, and I just really appreciate you taking the time to come out.
Well, sure. Thanks for having me.
Oh gosh, it's just saying it's a pleasure is. That's a bit of an understatement. So we are talking today about the Exodus. Now, I am going to move my screen so that it covers up the live chat because, as our regular viewers know, if I don't do that, I will lose track of everything. So Megan is, she's not here, but she is watching the live chat, and she's going to be texting me questions. So if you have questions, please tag her at Digital Hammurabi. And it looks like we've already gotten a couple texted in, so fantastic. How have you been, Dr. Bryson?
Doing okay. Just trying to get through the semester.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Well, why don't you if you don't mind, just take a minute. And I know that probably most of the people that are watching know who you are and know about the work that you've done, but just in case, maybe kind of walk people back through a little bit about who you are and your educational background, how amazing it was to be in classes with me.
Yeah, well, that's the thing I really remember about my time at Hopkins. So I'm Maggie Bryson. I'm a recent PhD graduate from the Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, and I am an Egyptologist. My specialty is in the art and archaeology of ancient Egypt, particularly the New Kingdom. Although, of course, like any Egyptologist, I've worked with Egyptian text and language a good bit. And Hopkins is a neat program because we have the opportunity to meet and interact with our friends and colleagues who study the biblical sources, who study ancient Mesopotamia, who study a lot of different areas. And we have a great sort of collaborative tradition here that I think has been really beneficial for me, you too. That's how, Josh and I came to know each other because we were in some of the same classes and, had a good chance to talk about a lot of these issues about, the connections between all these different parts of the ancient Near East and the ancient Mediterranean world. It was a big active world. My dissertation was on the reign of the pharaoh Horemheb. If anybody knows who he was. So a little bit later than the period we're mostly going to be talking about today, sort of. Although right smack dab in the middle of the second historical Exodus period. So we'll get to that, I'm sure, in a little bit.
Yeah, it's one of the really fun and horrible things about something like the Exodus, right? Because you have people coming at it. Probably people in the audience are coming at it from different directions, right? You have some people that are coming at it with like a religious background, a religious tradition that has a traditional view of the time of the Exodus and the extent of the Exodus. And if you see me look down, I apologize. I'm just checking the text in case there's a problem with the audio or something. Is the audio sounding okay to everybody? Does it sound okay to you, Dr. Bryson?
I'm good.
Okay, cool. But of course, it's difficult because the biblical text seems to say at least 2 or 3 different things about the timing of the Exodus, with respect to the creation of the world, then with respect to the building of Solomon's temple. It's very complicated, right? From just that perspective, and so I can't. It's difficult enough as somebody studying the biblical text to try to make sense of it. But being an Egyptologist, where you're having to actually deal with the data on the ground, and I suspect that it's either frustrating or annoying, or I don't know, because I suspect you have to hear about it a lot. So.
I don't actually find it annoying or frustrating at all to talk about the Exodus because I think this is one of the things that makes Egypt special. It's one of the things that makes Egypt interesting to people. If your sort of connection to the ancient world is through your faith, right, and you want to know about it for that reason, that's okay, right? And why do we do what we do? Why do we study the ancient world? There are things that can teach us about our world, and there are ways in which it can really enrich our experience. of the lives that we lead. And any way that it does that, any way ancient Egypt touches people's lives, I think is fair and interesting. And I'm happy to talk about it with anyone that comes at it from an open-minded perspective, right? That wants to learn and wants to talk. And I'm certainly not here to tell anyone what to believe, right? Ultimately, right, faith is a separate thing, and it's something that I respect. So I'm happy to talk about ancient Egypt to anybody that wants to jump in. So for any reason.
And this is one of the reasons that I really love our audience, because while we do have many people that would consider themselves to be very, very religious, even sometimes from a fundamentalist standpoint, most of the people that I interact with here and that Megan interacts with, they're open-minded, right? Even though they may hold things very closely, I still feel like on the whole, people are trying to get a more accurate picture, a more developed picture of reality. What is justified true belief? And so sometimes what that means is we have to face something like the Exodus, and we have to say, okay, what data do we have? What data don't we have? And do I have to be flexible in the things that I've thought leading up to this time? So I'm excited about today's discussion. So okay, sorry, just another question came in. So I have some questions for you, and I want this to go however you want it to go, frankly, because you're the expert here. And I know we talked about this, beforehand, and I know you're kind of going out on a limb with me here, because I know that this isn't your expertise. This isn't your direct, what you've studied, what you wrote your dissertation on or anything. But I appreciate you giving us at least, I'll tell you what I would be happy with, honestly, is just kind of a glimpse into what Egyptologists, in your experience, think about matters like this, issues like this, and how they handle them with a certain sense of, sensitivity. And what I guess what I'm thinking of in my mind is, we have a lot of people that come to our channel that believe in Zecharia Sitchin, right? And they hold to the things that that he has taught, he's written about, and that people have taught since he died. And I feel like one of the things that we do is try to be sensitive to that, and to not come at people and bash them over the head with the data, but to try to in a very kind way, as you were saying, talk about things in such a way that respects what it is that they hold and what they believe. So I'm excited just to have that conversation. So, well, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Okay.
I want to see what you got first.
So let's talk about maybe because we talked about it we touched on it for a second. What is the time frame for the Exodus story or stories, right? What are the different options that we have? And from sort of a historical background, what was going on at the time as far as the reigns of the pharaohs, or which dynasty would have been in power? I have taken, obviously, a full year of the Egyptian history cycle. I apologize that perhaps I don't remember as much as I should, but that's why you're here, to help me out, because it's not my field. It's not my field.
Well, you're going to have to give me a hand here on the biblical data. The way that I understand it is that, and again, I'm not an expert in the biblical aspect of this, but that there is a date of 480 years back from the fourth year of Solomon that has served as kind of the traditional touch point for dating the Exodus. And that puts us around 1450 BC, if we know, and again, you'll have to be gentle with me about how fixed the chronology is for on the biblical side, but that would put us about 1450 BC, if I understand right. And again, Egyptian chronology is touchy. We have a couple of different ways that we get at it. But right now, I think the best chronologies, or sort of the consensus chronologies, would put that in the reign of the Pharaoh Thutmose III. So we're talking about the late Bronze Age. We're talking about the New Kingdom, right? So Egypt's New Kingdom. And we're talking about the period when empire in Egypt was the idea that Egypt would have an empire in the Levant was first really kind of getting off the ground. So that's your traditional date, 1450 BC, reign of Thutmose III. There is another line of thinking, and this is something that comes out of Egyptologists wrangling. A lot of it comes out of this Egyptologists wrangling with the fact that there just isn't really any way to get at an Israelite population in Egypt. There is another date in the sort of around the first quarter of the 13th century BC. So that would be the reign of Ramses II, right? I think there are some biblical justifications for that, but again, like I said, I'm not an expert. The idea being that, well, if you count generations instead of years, or if there's some sort of non-literal, right, some sort of metaphorical ways to understand that 480 years that could put us back in the 13th century as opposed to the 15th century. So I would say that our two main sort of dates, our kings, would be Thutmose III or Ramses II, right, as the reign dates for those periods. And because Egyptian chronology isn't fixed, right, it's hard to, there's a lot of wiggle room on either side, right? Because when we're talking about a matter of decades, we could be off by 5 years on one end or the other, and we could have, somewhat different dates. But I would say because Ramses II and Thutmose III also happen to be the longest reigning pharaohs of the New Kingdom, it's pretty much however you count back, you land there. And those are two great periods of empire in ancient Egypt, right? So Thutmose III was our Napoleon. He was our warrior pharaoh, right? He led campaign after campaign, taking armies up into modern Israel, Lebanon, Syria. And he would have been interacting with sort of smaller local polities and sort of building a buffer, right? Sort of asserting Egypt's dominion in this sort of part of the world where other great empires, great powers were starting to build up strength. And the region that we think of, right, as the Israelite world, right? So modern Israel, Lebanon, Syria, on the coast there, was a buffer region. It was a place where there wasn't a strong central power, right, that held it all down. So it was a kind of bone of contention for all these great empires, right? Egypt wanted to be a presence in that area as much to keep the bad guys out, right, as to move Egypt's boundaries outward. Although that was, right, extending the boundaries of Egypt was one of the great tasks of any pharaoh, right? His job was to make Egypt great. So Thutmose III was fighting, campaign after campaign in that region. So there would have been a lot of Egyptian engagement. As to what things looked like on the ground in Egypt, right? And of course, anytime you have a war, right, or a situation of armed conflict in the ancient Near East, you're going to have prisoners, right? People moving back, right? Because the ancient Egyptians were very big on this. We're going to bring back, they would make notes of the number of captives they brought back as booty from these campaigns. And Thutmose III is very famous for the annals that he had inscribed on the walls of the great temple of Amun at Karnak, where he listed all the great stuff he brought back from the Levant in these campaigns. And at any of these points, right, either the reign of Thutmose III, reign of Ramses II, there would have been plenty of people of sort of Western Semitic, if that's a good way to think of it, origin about, because the ancient Egyptians had been dealing with their neighbors to the east for centuries at that point, right? So is that a good start? And you want to sort of...
Yeah, absolutely. And sorry, I've got a little mute button here because I'm always worried about feedback coming through my mic. So if you every time you start to talk, I'm probably going to mute myself just so we don't get into trouble with that. No, I mean, and I think that the fact that that the eastern part of the Mediterranean there, that coast, that portion of the Levant, where Canaan is, where Israel is, the fact that was a buffer played such an important role, not just in this period of the second half of the second millennium that we're talking about, but of course into the first millennium you see the Neo-Assyrian Empire moving again and again, ultimately trying to get down to Egypt to not be friendly with them, and that that strip of land was a really important thing, and so you had to take really significant control of it, or at least maintain it in such a way that your army wouldn't be hit from the back as you're coming back through it. So it's never surprising, I suppose, to find out that there's significant interaction between Egypt and that portion of Palestine. So no, I think that's great. So one, I do find it interesting in light of that I guess the pharaohs could have been the first "Make America Great Again," but I guess they would have been "Make Egypt Great Again." That had red mega hats or something, I guess. But Moshe mega, he didn't build a wall though, I don't suppose. So that was lame, and I apologize.
Well, the ancient Egyptians had a series of fortresses. No, but it's a good one because the ancient Egyptians had a series of fortresses, right, along the along their sort of eastern border. So, in the New Kingdom, it's particularly famous, right? The Way of Horus, right? The sort of route that the Egyptian army and trade could have taken through the northeast part of Egypt into the Sinai. So they had a couple of big fortresses out there, Tel Habwa, Tel Borg. So
a lot of comparisons, I guess, between ancient Egypt and modern day America. Oh.
You can find a metaphor for every look.
Indeed. Well, okay, so in light of that, if we're talking about, just so that I and everybody else listening kind of get an idea, historically speaking here, hear a lot of talk about the Hyksos and the Apiru, Abiru, Habiru. A lot of that stuff floats around. I think there's a lot of misinformation about it. Do you feel like maybe walking us through who the Hyksos were? Kind of give it a little background of the time period that would have been, how that might play into this. Again, I'll just call them the Hapiru, but however we want to call it, and how that affects possibly the discussion about the Exodus, and should it or should it not. That's a lot that I've asked you there.
No, it's okay. I'm just trying to think what the best place to start there is. So the Hyksos, right, sort of broadly speaking, are our 14th to 16th dynasties in Egypt. It was a period when we had people of sort of West Semitic speakers, right? People who were clearly, by all accounts, of foreign origin, ruling as kings in Egypt. And they ruled from a site in the Eastern Delta called Tel Deba or Avaris. And we don't know precisely who they were or how they got there. But we have a pretty good idea, I think, in general, that the Hyksos, right, the word Hyksos comes from the ancient Egyptian term 𝒀₂ the rulers of foreign lands. And the early Hyksos rulers actually called themselves that, right? They understood they understood themselves, right, as kind of foreigners living and ruling in Egypt.
Didn't Josephus then translate that later incorrectly, something like the shepherd kings?
The shepherd kings. Yeah. No, but it's pretty clear that it comes from this Egyptian term 𒀭₂, right? But again, those spurious etymologies are all over these later accounts, right? Because people would have these words and I heard somebody say that. What does it come from, right? And they would want something meaningful right away that would explain it, right? And the idea of these people as pastoralists, right? People who come from a region where, moving around with your livestock was a big component of the economy. People who moved around with their livestock were a big component of the social economic fabric. Would have probably made a lot of sense to Josephus and his contemporaries. It might have made sense to people even before that.
Well, right? I think it also could, depending on how you translate, it could be the ones of the fiery rocket ship. I'm not sure, but
that would work for me. Do we have a Lebanese space program we could go to for that? I mean, but again, it's a reasonable guess, right? But there's so much, there's no reason for. I mean, it's interesting that that's what Josephus came up with, but the word comes from much more likely this Egyptian rulers of foreign lands, and so we're talking around 1600 BC, just to give you a rough date, right? The Hyksos were driven out of Egypt by the Egyptian pharaohs Seqenenre, Kamos, and Ahmose around, and so that process kind of comes to its culmination around 1550 BC, which is our round date for the beginning of the New Kingdom, right? So the New Kingdom rulers, Thutmose III, Ramses II, would have been well aware of this period when there were people of Levantine origin, right? So from Syria, Palestine, ruling Egypt, or at least ruling most of it, right, from this stronghold, if you will, in the Delta. And the thing is, how the Hyksos got to be who they were, right? How we came to have kings who spoke Western Semitic language, right? Who had Semitic names. And again, if I'm saying Western Semitic and there's something about that I'm confused. Okay. But who spoke this Semitic language, who had Semitic names, right? There was one called Yaqub Har, whose name comes up in connection with the idea of there being Israelites in Egypt a fair bit. Right. And again, how common a name would Yaqub have been?
I mean, I haven't
Right?
done I haven't done studies on personal names during the period, but I suspect it would be common enough.
Yeah, I mean, if I understand the Egyptian sources correctly, it does occur in other personal names, not just in this context. So it's one of those things, right? If I say something like that, I don't want anybody to sort of grab on that and go, "Oh, Professor Bryson or Dr. Bryson said," right?
I mean, just so that everybody knows, again, the two of us here, while I would say, and Dr. Bryson, you feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, I feel like while we may not be experts in this area. Certainly, I'm not an expert in the Exodus from a Hebrew Bible standpoint, and Dr. Bryson is not an expert in the Exodus from an Egyptological standpoint. What we mean by that is that we didn't write our dissertations on this. This isn't the specific area that we've spent 3 or 4 years working on. So on the one hand, we feel very comfortable talking about scholarly consensus. What are the main views? Because we have the ability to read through not only the primary sources, but also the secondary literature and to evaluate it. But that doesn't mean that we're going to feel comfortable saying A is true and not B in many of these circumstances. So I think a good balance, I think, to everybody watching to understand that's important. And I probably come to almost every stream anytime that I talk on here, unless I'm talking about old Babylonian liturgical and literary texts in unorthographic form from the city of Kish. And even then, I'm probably going to say, but I could be wrong about that. So, yeah, I think that's important to kind of point out.
But so the Hyksos, there's a history in ancient Egypt of people from the Levant coming to Egypt for a variety of reasons, to trade as mercenaries, right, in alliance with Egyptians in periods when there was a lot of conflict, either within Egypt or on Egypt's borders. Plenty of people by this around 1600, right, so by the 17th century BC, had come to Egypt either willingly or unwillingly and settled there over the course of many hundreds of years, possibly thousands. So by the time the Hyksos, these rulers who took Egyptian-style titles, who put their names in cartouches, right, who presented themselves as pharaohs of Egypt in the classical tradition of ancient Egyptian kingship, by the time these people were ruling from their city of Avaris, there had for a very long time been communities of people of Asiatic, right, of Levantine origin, living and working in Egypt for a variety of reasons. And Josephus actually, sort of quoting Manetho, describes the Hyksos as invaders. He describes them as sort of people who what was it that he actually said? He said they came to Egypt and conquered it without striking a blow, right? So even in that tradition there's this awareness, right, or this idea that the Hyksos didn't even necessarily have to really be invaders, right? There were people who had been coming from that region for a very long time. There were settlements of people who still retained markers of what we could call ethnic identity, right, of this sort of West Semitic ethnic identity, who were living and working in Egypt, particularly in the Eastern Delta, so in that area around Tel Adaba and Avaris. You'll find pottery that's typical of the Levant, the Middle Bronze Age Levant. You'll find representations of people, statues, images, and tomb paintings and things. You'll find people, so there are lists of workers. So the Middle Kingdom pyramid city of Kahun, for instance, we have a lot of administrative papyri from Kahun. So the lists of workers and supplies and money coming in and going out that the ancient Egyptian administrators kept. And there are lists of Asiatic workers who were staying there. There's a famous list of, in Thebes too, probably. So all over Egypt, right? There's a famous list from Thebes of women workers who were making fabric. They were textile workers in this Middle Kingdom period. So the early second millennium BC. And we know from their names that they were from this Levantine milieu, that they were Semitic speakers. And they were living there making textiles. They may have come as prisoners of war. They may have come through trade. They may have come because their fathers' husbands were mercenaries. There were a couple of different reasons they could have been there. I think probably that idea that prisoners coming from these campaigns that the Egyptian pharaohs would have waged on their eastern border is probably the best idea as to how that many of them got there, right? But over time, right, we'll find these sort of this evidence, right, of people of Semitic origin in Egypt, and over time, they tend to kind of disappear. They sort of peter out. It seems that we'd have these influxes of people from the Levant who would then become Egyptianized over time. So their kids would take Egyptian names, would begin to participate in Egyptian cults, right? So their religion would change. Again, how you talk about religion for the ancient world is a little bit tricky. But they would become Egyptianized over time, right? As they intermarried and sort of developed into parts of their local communities. So by the time in this 17th century BC that the Hyksos are ruling Egypt, they don't necessarily have to have been conquerors in the traditional sense, right? You're not thinking about a wave of armed Levantine princes coming and attacking the border with Egypt where they would have been completely foreign or new, right? There would have been people who spoke their language and had some of their traditions living in Egypt at the time. And it's possible that the Hyksos themselves weren't really an invading force at all, right? That this was the sort of rise of Hyksos, the Hyksos had to do as much with people who'd been there for a long time and had roots in Egypt, kind of developing enough social and economic clout that they were able to kind of put themselves in this position of being rulers of Egypt.
And I think that's an important thing. Two things here that I kind of want to maybe recap what you said, just so that everybody can. We really want to pull away two things from this. Number one, just because you have ethnic markers or things that show people of foreign origin in a particular area, that doesn't mean that they're an invading force. It doesn't mean that they're there and it's something new. It's something fresh. You always have people, and this isn't just in Egypt. It's really we have it in Mesopotamia all over the place, right? Oppenheim, in his book on Mesopotamia, we have a summarized video of it on our channel. But he talks about this, people in the hinterland, right? People on the outside, and there's always this interaction between the people that are in the country and people that are in the city, right? And you end up with what the texts seem to say are these invading forces, right? The people from the West, and here they come and they've conquered us. When in reality, these people have always been there. And so I think that's an important thing to set up as a basic premise here for this discussion, that when we talk about the Exodus, we're not talking about this new influx of Asiatics, right? This is something that's been ostensibly been in there for a while, and they've come to power. And as I understand it, the Hyksos, they weren't the first Asiatic dynasty, were they? I think was it the 14th dynasty, 13th?
These are the 14th through the 16th. There are Hyksos dynasties. Right?
Oh, okay.
So this is the first time that we have people of marked Asiatic origin in Egypt as rulers, and they were clearly foreign, right? In the sense that they even referred to themselves, at different points as the rulers of foreign lands, or there was this idea that they were not Egyptian. But at the same time, right, and it was something that the Egyptians themselves seem to have thought of and remembered as a kind of episode, right? Something that was outside of their normal view of how the world ought to work. People who were not Egyptian did not become kings of Egypt. Of course, how you define Egyptian, is very flexible, right? And we're jumping around in time here too, right? Because we're talking about the Exodus, right? But the idea that there was a group of people living in Egypt, right, who identified as a group, right, who were Israelites per se, right, the descendants of this particular biblical patriarch, right, and his sons who stayed in Egypt for, how long was it, 400 years that the Israelites were meant to have been captive in Egypt?
400, 430, it just depends on
Right. So the
different time
idea
frames.
that there was a discrete group of people who were, we could call Israelites, descendants of patriarchs, right, who thought of themselves as a discrete group of people who had been living in Egypt for a fixed period of time, and then came under oppression and had to flee altogether into the desert at once, right? That is the Exodus narrative we're talking about, right? So we have to ask ourselves, first of all, when and how did people who might have been Israelites, right, so Semitic speakers, come to Egypt? How long were they there? Did they maintain this discrete community or ethnic identity, if you will? And then would they all have picked up and left all at once in this movement into the desert, right? Of at least thousands of people, right? And then, so we have to think in those terms, and then we have to think, what kind of mark would that episode have left on the Egyptian landscape, in Egyptian texts, on the Egyptian view of history, had it happened, right? And, the idea that the Exodus could somehow, the Exodus narrative could somehow contain like snapshots, ideas, right, of things that could have happened in Bronze Age Egypt, I don't think is completely out of the question. People in oral traditions and can preserve fairly accurate memories over very long spans of time, right? But the idea that we have to have a literal fixed truth, that there has to be evidence on the ground in Egypt for exactly what Exodus says happened, that's the real problem.
Yeah, and I think we should probably talk for just a second about what it is that the biblical text is saying. So, you're talking about 600,000 men, right? And the obviously there are people that want to reread some of the Hebrew words there, but from a consensus standpoint, I think you're talking about 600,000 men, which when you factor in, as the discussion always turns to, women, children, you're talking anywhere between 2 and 3 million people. And so, the idea of 2 or 3 million people, even the idea of 600,000 people walking out of Egypt, first of all, as you just said, maintaining this discrete ethnicity, because by the whole point of the Exodus story is that you have a group of people, a very large group of people, whatever the number is, that are being enslaved and persecuted because they are Israelites, right? And so they've maintained those ethnic markers. They've distinguished themselves in that way. And so when you talk about things like people coming in and settling and then becoming, I'm blanking on the word, but they're adopting the culture and becoming acclimated, not acclimated,
Acculturated,
okay, yeah. That didn't happen ostensibly, and at least according to the text. So these are the things that I think, at least we on the biblical side have to deal with, and I suspect that when you look into this, you as an Egyptologist, you these are the things that you have to wrestle with. These are the data points that you have to make fit in a model. So, should we talk briefly about the problem of the Apiru or the Habiru?
Sure, let's talk about the Apiru. So the ancient Egyptians, so in the ancient Egyptian language, as in many languages of the region, right, there's a word for Apiru or Habiru, right? People that moved about, apparently, right? When we talk about Apiru for ancient Egypt, the ancient Egyptians had a lot of words for people from the Levant. They could be called, the most sort of, our mainline word for people from the Levant is Amu, right? So an Ain, Aleph, Mu, or M, wow. And they also had words for Bedouin, Shasu, that we translate 𝀭Su conventionally as Bedouin. The 𝀭_Use in the Old Kingdom, the dwellers upon the sand. So there were a lot of words for people from the East, Asiatics, if you will, people that we would assume probably spoke Semitic languages, things like that, right? And one of these words could have been Apiru. But in the Egyptian context, Apiru is usually negative, right? We talk about the Apiru are people who cause trouble in all sorts of contexts. And we think about them in the Egyptian context, right? I'm thinking about a particular Amarna letter, right? Where one of these kings from these Canaanite kings, or these sort of local statelets, writes to the Egyptian king and says the Apiru or Habiru are the letters in Akkadian, right? That are causing us problems. Egypt's not helping us. Where are you guys? Right? But this is a long-standing problem. And the people that we think about in Egypt, right, who could be if we had Israelites in Egypt, which we don't, to be clear, but if we did, are usually called Amu, right? The Hyksos were called Amu in the Egyptian texts. The Hyksos are not Apiru, right? But the Apiru, to the extent that I really know anything about the problem, are sort of just one of any number of groups of people, right? That would have been sort of about and causing, issues for the settled states of the Near East, including the Egyptians, right? It's not, as far as we can tell, an ethnonym, right? A word that describes an ethnic group who would have seen themselves as Apiru necessarily.
So that everybody, just to maybe give a touch of clarity from the Hebrew side. So Apiru, you have a Hebrew word that is ayin beit resh, which is avar, to cross over, and the Hebrews are called ivrit, right, or the ivriim. So that ayin beit resh. So there was thought that there would be this connection between Apiru or Abiru, because the B, P, there's a lot of overlap, between the B and the P in these languages. And so, Apiru, Abiru, Avar, Ivrit, all of these seem to, maybe these are the Hebrews, right? Maybe these are but as what you're saying, is that's not a name that's given to the Hyksos. And as I remember from Professor McCarty's class, if I'm remembering this correctly, was the consensus view that the Habiru were like mercenaries, or they were sort of loose bands that different people could be called Habiru, right? And I think there was connection drawn to David, but now I'm kind of getting further afield than.
But you're right. I mean, the ancient Egyptians had, going back to the Old Kingdom, right, problems with what seemed to be mobile groups of people, kind of coming in and trying to get a foot in the door in the Delta, particularly in the Delta, right? So there's an Old Kingdom text, so from, around, let's just say 2300, thereabouts BC, where a guy named Weni talks about the fact that the king of Egypt sent him out to this northeastern border of Egypt, to kind of deal with people who were trying to make inroads into Egypt. Or at least that seems to be that's our interpretation of it, right? Like, he fought with sand dwellers, right? And so we think these are probably people who were coming at Egypt from the east, and they were probably more or less nomadic, right? And in the Old Kingdom, right, we have this famous scene from the Pharaoh Unas, right? It's Saqqara, where there are these people who are clearly represented as emaciated, right? They're these thin, hungry people. And the idea is that they've come to Egypt, right, sort of seeking nourishment from this fertile Nile Valley, right? We're talking here about the 3rd millennium BC. They've come to Egypt seeking nourishment in this much more prosperous land at a time when whatever their means of livelihood, right, living either in the sort of desert or on the very fringes of the sort of habitable areas, right, the cultivable areas, where they might have had livestock, but not been settled farmers, at least not most of the time. And in periods when the climate dried up, or there was unrest for any reason, their livelihood would have fallen apart and they would have needed help, and they might have come to Egypt, saying, because it is a place where there is abundance. It is a place where there is farming, and so they're protected to some extent from these kinds of periods of upheaval. And the ancient Near East seems to always have been a place where people who were settled, right, who lived, like the ancient Egyptians, right, lived in settlements. They had houses and cities in the fertile Nile Valley where they grew crops, right? But there always seems to be a component, right, people who lived on the edges of these fertile agricultural areas, who kept livestock, who moved around at least part of the year, right? And those people don't leave a lot of traces, right? They weren't writing their own histories, but they seem to have been around. We have them, probably in the Nubian border in southern Egypt. We have them in the Near East, in the Levant, in Mesopotamia, right? And, people who were displaced for any reason from these settlements, who fell out of grace with rulers of cities, who fell out of grace with the king of Egypt, right, might have found themselves forced to sort of flee into these marginal environments where people made their livings in a variety of ways. Herding livestock and occasionally raiding settled cities, right? You run low on supplies. Where are you going to go to get them? You can requisition things, right? And there's actually a famous story of the ancient Egyptian Sinuhe, right? Again, we're going back to the Middle Kingdom, so the early 2nd millennium BC, who, when he heard of a conspiracy to murder the pharaoh, had to flee Egypt, and he went straight to the Levant. He went to Canaan, right? He had overheard this plot, and he was afraid he'd be implicated because he had been close to the conspirators. And so he picked up sticks and he fled to Rechenu, right, probably modern day Lebanon, and joined up with a local sort of leader, a local chieftain, right? And his life there seems to have been kind of hard. So we think of him as living with, a group possibly of these sort of semi-nomadic people. And when things cooled off in Egypt, Sinuhe came back from the Levant. He went from, and again, like this idea of David, right? He became, he fell out of favor, he fell out of grace, and he had to flee and sort of live on the run for a while, right? And sort of find a group of people that he could live with on the margins of society, making a living by whatever means necessary. And then he comes back, right? The story of Sinuhe sort of echoes this fact that there are these mobile people sort of living on the fringes that you can kind of join up with and then come back. And Sinuhe comes back to Egypt and basically takes a shower and puts his nice clothes on. And they're like, oh, we thought you were an Asiatic, but now that you've cleaned up, we see that you're Egyptian, right? He came back to civilization, as it were. But the Apiru, the idea that Apiru, Hebrew, Israelite, right? This is a group of people that were distinct, that had an identity as, related people who were culturally and linguistically, even if not linguistically or culturally unique, right? And function every unit is, I think, there's no basis for that, right?
Yeah, I think as we've said a number of times, when it comes to these sorts of interesting, but not but incorrect connections, we always say if you think that something that's been debated for a long time, if you think it's simple, you probably don't understand it. I am getting little signals here saying that the stream is like, I don't know what it looks like, but I just remembered that I'm on the Wi-Fi and I didn't physically plug the cable in. So I was going to ask you the next question and let you talk about it while I'm gone to get the cable, but I want to hear what you say. So can I ask you a question that's not really related to this, so that you can talk to the people, but I won't miss something that I need to hear. Is Die Hard 1 a Christmas movie? I'll be right back.
Die Hard is a movie all year round. I hope Josh comes back pretty quick. I don't want to leave him with dead air, but how could anybody say that Die Hard 1 isn't a Christmas movie? Come on, it's the best part of Christmas. There was some lag on my end too there, Josh, so I'm hoping that got it fixed.
Okay, I have plugged the cable in, and hopefully that will, because it was saying on the screen like stream status bad. We're not getting any signals. Let me just check and see if Megan has said that it's no good. No, I haven't seen anything. So hopefully, if you are having problems, everybody out there, please let me know. So what did we determine? Did we determine that Die Hard is a Christmas movie?
Die Hard is definitely a Christmas movie. It's
Beautiful.
the best part of Christmas. It's the way you get out of watching other Christmas movies. So that you convince everyone else that, hey, at least it's Christmassy. Let's watch Die Hard instead.
Right. Oh gosh. Well, okay. So let me ask this. So we're at about the 45-minute mark, and I told Dr. Bryson that we'd talk for about an hour, which I know is a little shorter than what we normally do, but I know that there are going to be lots of questions from the chat, and I want to leave enough time for those. And again, Dr. Bryson's going to, and we'll do the best that we can to try to answer these questions from both sides of this issue. But if we have to come back to some of these things, do some research and do a blog post later, or like another live stream or something. Of course, we always want Dr. Bryson to come back and talk to us. So maybe this will be a way to get her to come back. So ask really hard questions, everyone. I'm just kidding. Please don't do that.
Go for it. I always say it keeps me honest, right? If I'm not ready to answer some hard questions, then I need to beef up my chops here.
Right. But before we do, what I want to do is talk briefly about, and I'll just read the question that I had prepared here. What are the different scholarly positions that are taken on the Exodus story, and is there a general consensus view? And before you answer, I mentioned earlier this book that came out. There was a conference in San Diego, I think, had a whole bunch of Egyptologists and biblical scholars there that were looking at the Exodus from a lot of different positions. And I was going to play a video clip of someone, a friend of mine, that made a comment some time ago saying that essentially the scholars, the consensus view in that book is that the Exodus was a real thing and it really happened. Now, I don't necessarily disagree with that, right? However, what I understand about what they're saying, and perhaps what somebody who isn't familiar with this discussion might hear, are two different things. So when we say the Exodus happened, and I know that you're familiar with this volume, what is it, would you say, that they mean? And what is the difference between like historical kernel and the actual story as it has been interpreted traditionally there in the book of Exodus? So it's kind of scholarly consensus. Is there one, and what are the nuanced views of the Exodus story as far as from the Egyptologist perspective?
So from an Egyptologist's perspective, I would say that the consensus view is that there's not a lot of point in talking about it. I don't know of a single Egyptologist who would tell you that the Exodus happened exactly as it's said to have happened in the Bible. There's just no basis to think that from an Egyptological standpoint. There are Egyptologists, most of them I would say probably older, who think that there are historical kernels, as you said, to be found in the biblical Exodus narrative. That means that there are things about the Exodus narrative that reflect things that happened in Egypt. In other words, that there were people who would have been like the Israelites, right? Who would have had things culturally, linguistically, and probably religiously in common with them. And that those people had an experience of living in Egypt during this late Bronze Age period that was not positive, and that some of those people may have found their way back to the Levant, and that their descendants told stories about the time when their ancestors still lived in Egypt, or that there were people living in Egypt of Levantine origin who would have communicated with people still living in the Levant. and shared ideas and memories about bad experiences, good experiences, right? Because the Exodus story goes back to the period, right, when Joseph is the advisor to Pharaoh, right, when the Israelites are doing pretty well for themselves in Egypt. And then, over the course of several hundred years, their fortunes decline, and to the point that they become oppressed, right, and enslaved, and they have to flee, right? And there are people who think that maybe the Exodus story reflects a sort of mixture of memories of all the different ways that people of Levantine origin experienced life in Egypt during the Bronze Age. And then their descendants have kind of packaged it up into a thing that was meaningful to them in the Iron Age, right? Sort of made a story out of all these different kind of half-remembered episodes, put names to kind of archetypal figures, right? Joseph, it represents all of the Asiatics, all of the Levantine, people of Levantine origin who became successful. Moses and his ilk sort of represent all the Asiatic people of Asiatic origin who were sort of taken as prisoners of war and served as slaves in Egyptian households and institutions over the course of the Bronze Age, and that their descendants then kind of put together this story out of it. There are Egyptologists who will talk seriously about the Exodus. The idea might have been a historical moment when there was a giant movement of people of Levantine origin out of Egypt, or an influx, right? Sort of an influx in the first place, and then a departure in the second place. Not literally, right, in the sense that it happened in the biblical narrative, but that this might have been a thing. Those people are very much in the minority. And you see there, most of them are in that volume, right? So James Hoffmeyer is a big proponent of this idea of a historical kernel to the Exodus. There's a famous Egyptologist named Jan Assmann, whose ideas are problematic and contested, but who's very influential, who thinks of the Exodus as a kind of cultural memory. Right? The way I was describing this to you, right? The idea that you have lots of sort of half-remembered episodes that you assign meaning to, right? That view, I think, is one that you would find Egyptologists willing to at least engage with. In cultural memory, the way I always describe it, right, is let's say, right, you're a person who's really who's tough, who doesn't take no for an answer, who loves to get what they want, right? And your mom will tell the story about the time when you were 2 and you learned to say no, and that was the only word you'd say for the whole of the third year of your life, right? You might not have been exactly 2 when you started saying no, and you definitely said things other than no, right? And all sorts of kids go through their no phase, right? But for your mom, right, the thing that sort of defines you as a person is that defiant, tough, bullheaded streak. And so that story of your past helps to define and articulate that aspect of your personality, right? And so for someone like Assmann, who thinks in terms of memory and the formation of identity, right, the Exodus is a story that takes those little episodes. They don't have to be remembered precisely. They don't have to be, right, but it kind of blends them into a story that helps to define people, So.
And I think that, kind of following up on that, the proverbial or the stereotypical fish story, right, that people will tell. If you're a weightlifter and you lift 300 pounds one time, as you tell that story, and it was a momentous time, boy, I lifted 300 pounds. As time goes by, 5, 10, 15 years, and you tell that story as this pinnacle, that weight it won't ever go down. Right? You're never going to say less weight than 300 pounds, but you're very likely going to, it might extend. You might say, so that was, 100 roughly 150 kilos that I lifted. Well, that's 330 pounds. And then you go back to pounds. I mean, I'm not thinking that people go through that process, but your fish never gets smaller in your stories, right? And so I think that it's very important to, number one, say that just because the majority of scholars in that volume in particular, since we're talking about it, would say, and I think it is the majority, would say that there's probably some sort of historical kernel, be it anything from maybe some people were enslaved there and made it out, a handful, and brought that story that became mythologized later to explain the origins of the nation. Anything from that to something as simple as simple is not the right word there, but during the period, this period of that land being hotly contested back and forth as that buffer zone, and the Egyptians ultimately being defeated or losing power over that region, and they feel this sense of freedom, and they've been liberated from the bondage, and that cultural memory develops. So I think it's important that, number one, just because we have scholars saying that there is a historical kernel does not mean that they're all saying the Exodus in the first 15 chapters of Exodus happened in that way. That's not what they're saying. So we need to be very careful about that. On the other side, we don't want to discount the possibility of this remembered historical kernel and traditions that develop and are carried on. I think it would be foolish of us to say that neither of those things are not possible. So,
but at the same time, that volume, right? There are half dozen Egyptologists contributed to that volume, and that's probably about as many Egyptologists that will even talk about the Exodus. It's just not something that we deal with, because even Egyptologists who study foreigners in Egypt during the Bronze Age don't think of it in those terms, because there isn't any reason to, right? There are no Israelites in Egypt, effectively, in our text. There's no indication, right, that these people are in any way the kind of population that the traditional Exodus narrative reflects. And so we just wouldn't think about it, right?
I think in Hoffmeyer's, I'm trying to remember what page it was. In Hoffmeyer's article, I think he's talking about how Egyptologists in general have. No, I won't be able to find it. Watch. How about I go to the table of contents? But Hoffmeyer's, talking about how have Egyptologists dealt with the Exodus, and what he hopes will be, how they will deal with it moving forward. I just wanted to find it because he does a little what he calls an unscientific survey. Page 197. And I wanted to ask you about another Egyptologist, Kenneth Kitchen, here in just a moment, if you don't mind me asking.
Not at all.
But he's another, and not just in Egyptological circles, right? I mean, his name comes up a lot in debates about the dating of the Book of Daniel, for example. At any rate, but he says here that. Where is he has two questions. I hope I'm remembering the correct article. Watch.
I mean, in any case, Hoffmeyer and Kitchen are two of the. Those are literally the two Egyptologists whose names would come to my mind, along with, I think, maybe Thomas Schneider, just a couple of other people, right, who even talk about these things. And Professor Kitchen is very famous, I think, for his, apart from his very real contributions to our field, right, his commitment to a very what we call a positivistic view of history, right? The idea that there are discrete, fixed facts that we can know. And Professor Kitchen is also very committed to the idea that the Bible is a historical document. And when you come at something with a commitment like that, you tend to find the evidence you're looking for. And I think a big part of the reason that a lot of people have come to the study of ancient Egypt over the years, going way back, back to the 19th century, right, when everyone came to the study of the Near East from the perspective that we want to know more about the Hebrew Bible, right, more or less. Either you want to disprove it or you want to prove it, but in either case, right, the reason we want to know about this world is because it bears on our understanding of the Hebrew Bible. And I think that Professor Kitchen is maybe one of those people, right, who is very interested in the historicity of the Bible, and so that's going to inform his research agenda. And he's came to this in a period, I think, when there was probably more sort of latitude to even have these conversations, right? When our approach to history was still a little bit more positivistic. But I don't think there are many people left really who would even engage with it the way he does, much less take that attitude of we can find the historical characters, we can find the timeline. And the timeline, again, Professor Kitchen is very big on timeline. He's one of our chronological gurus, right? One of like 3 or 4 people who really drill down into chronology, and he, why would anyone really want to know Egyptian chronology? Well, going back to the 17th century, people have been interested, and probably beyond, but the sort of thinker, the sort of scholars that I can think of, right, who would have been interested in this, going back to the 17th century, people wanted to know about Egyptian chronology because they wanted to be able to date the events in the biblical world. They wanted to either prove or disprove the timeline that's laid out in the Bible. So it's a very old conversation, and there are only a very few people in Egyptology now who would even really have that conversation, So I think most Egyptologists don't even realize that a lot of our obsession with chronology, or the extent to which chronology has featured in our literature, has to do with this question of biblical timeline.
And I think that leads me into one last question, and then I just looked at the time, and we'll get into it because there are a lot of questions. The phone has been vibrating, so that's great. But we've had to deal with this. We actually did a stream. Megan did a stream. Digital Hammurabi, why do you hate the Bible? And of course, it was said tongue in cheek because, of course, we don't hate the Bible. I would like I hate, if I hate the Bible, I hate the Epic of Gilgamesh, right? I mean, like they're, and I think that there is this underlying assumption when you say, for example, Hofmeyr and Kitchen are the only ones that really come at this in this way, and the majority of scholars don't look at it this way. Well, it's because you're all out to disprove Christianity. Your motivation is to disprove the Bible. That's you're against the Bible and you're against the supernatural because this is what's levied against us, right? Well, you just want to prove the Bible wrong. And of course, my response to that is, like, what do you mean I want to prove it wrong?
I'm not out to prove the annals of Thutmose III wrong, and I'm certainly not out, right, to dispute. I'm not out. I don't deny that the Pope exists, right? I don't. I'm an historian, right? And ultimately, right, I'm skeptical of everything in the sense, if you take skepticism as the desire to kind of engage with the first thing any academic is going to ask you about anything, right? Anytime you hear a statement, it's Friday, the first thing a historian is going to do is say, how do we know that it's Friday, right? Are you sure it's Friday, right? No one's ever just going to go, okay, yeah, it's Friday, right? Like, that's it. I'm exaggerating, but you get my point, right? So we take that approach to everything, right? When I look at ancient Egyptian texts, this happens a lot for ancient Egypt, right? There are a lot of accounts where we say a pharaoh went to war. And we look at those and we go, did he really? Right? Because the ancient Egyptians made stuff up, in point of fact, right? If a pharaoh had maybe, and again, we argue about this for Egyptian texts. Is this an historical kernel or is it a literal truth? An Egyptian pharaoh might say, oh, I fought a war in Canaan, right? I waged war against the sand dwellers or whoever, the Amu. And he would give a list of toponyms. He would say, I attacked Ashkelon, I attacked right? And the ancient Egyptian pharaohs did that, right? They were very conscious of the toponymy of the Levant in the Bronze Age. And we have toponym lists, right? And of course, Israel features in them, at least, right, in the Merneptah Stela. And there's a statue base in Berlin that may be an even earlier attestation of Israel as an ethnonym or a toponym, right, in the context of pharaohs waging campaigns in the Levant. But if you see that, if a pharaoh makes a claim like that, and you find that his grandfather had literally the exact same wording, right, for a campaign that he waged in that place, you think, I wonder if maybe the grandson just kind of ripped it off from the granddad, right? Like, we take that same approach to ancient Egyptian texts too. So, I don't hate the Bible any more than you do, right? And so, we're looking at history, and that, for me, it can be, right, connected with your faith, right? If understanding history helps you to deepen, right, some aspect of your relationship with your faith and your understanding of God, then that's fantastic, right? But thinking about it in terms of habits of mind, how you think about things, right? We try as hard as we can to let the historical evidence kind of do its thing, right? Let's tell a history. Right. Let's look at historical documents in as objective. Again, I hate the word objective, right? Because nobody ever really is, right? But in as dispassionate a way as we can, and try to come up with consistent, effective ways of using historical documents to get at whatever questions we're trying to ask. And then on the other side, right, let's think about our faith, right?
And and then we'll get into the questions. But I mean, I just think this is so unbelievably important to talk about, because if you start with your conclusion, if that's where you start,
Yeah.
what the confirmation bias that you were describing, you end up finding these little difficulties, what you consider to be little difficulties, and you think to yourself, is there a way that I can interpret this so that it will work in my favor, right? And you don't cognitively, I mean, you don't consciously go through that. But for example, if you start with a presumption, for example, that the book of Daniel is written early, right, and it's written before all of the events that it purports to predict occurred, then you come to problems like some of the historical issues that you see, and you say, okay, is there a way that we can possibly understand this so that it gives some... Is it possible that we could read this word in this way? Is there any way that we could do that? There is. That's the answer. And the problem with doing that, if it's not obvious from how what I've just said, is that what we're trying to do, as you say, trying to be as dispassionate as possible, is we're trying to come to these data points that we all have. And I've said this before, but we all have data points. We're working with the data points. You and I saw that when we used to sit in those archaeological classes together with Professor Schwartz. And you'd read 6 different articles and a book, and they all are working with the same 8 data points, but they're all bringing a model that accounts for those data points differently. And it's our job to find those assumptions that connect the data points, right? Where are the assumptions? And the model that wins out the day, right, is the one that has the least assumptions connecting the data points, and the one that makes the most sense and accounts for the data points in the most plausible way. Does it mean that it always has all the answers? No, of course not. Otherwise, that wouldn't be a debated topic. But that's that's what we should be going for. Not so much, can we definitively prove that this is the only way to understand this? No, we wouldn't get anything done. But which model that we're coming to the data points with accounts for them the best, with the least amount of assumptions? So,
Well, and I have to say this, right, because it's something I've been thinking about a lot lately, right? Any data point is only as good as the context in which you understand it too, right? If you want to make an argument that something really special happened, you have to know what's normal, right? Like if you want to talk about, right, like people are always talking about, oh, we found Joseph, right? There's a famous vizier, right, whose tomb was discovered in the 1980s by a French archaeologist. And this man's name was Upper El, right? Maybe Abdi El, right? Maybe his name was the servant of El, and again, we think that he was a man of Levantine origin, right? He was probably from a family that spoke a Semitic language and had come from this part of the world. And he rose to become the vizier, he became the highest official in Egypt. People are like, great, we found Joseph, right? But if you're not aware of other instances in which people of foreign origin have risen to power in ancient Egypt, if you're not aware of, right, the fact that this guy's son, right, his name was probably Amenhotep, right? Already, this guy, one generation later, this guy's son has become Egyptianized, right? And his sort of the idea that he could be the patriarch for this discrete group of people who maintained their Israelite religion and identity, right? If you don't know the whole picture, you're going to lose perspective and interpret something incorrectly. I'm not saying that it's not really cool that this guy was there, or even, right, that the character of Joseph could preserve some kind of memory of people who did this. But unless you ask for the whole picture, you're not going to know how to deal with one piece of evidence or one data point, as you say.
and that's what we've got to really guard against is finding what we consider to be something conceivable, something possible, and saying that's all I need, right? We have to make sense of the context. So, all right. Well, this is fantastic, and I am noticing that we have a lot of super chats. Thank you all very, very much. Dr. Bryson, do you remember what super chats are? It's when people can pay to make a
Not
comment,
one.
um, and that they're donating
Oh,
money to make a comment. So
well, great.
yeah, so thank you all very, very much. So I'm going to read those first, and we have a tradition here, so that everybody knows that I read these. If Megan is here, Megan reads the super chats in her seductive voice, and if I'm here, I read them in my Kent Hovind voice. So uh, I apologize in advance. So here we go. Uh, so we have a super chat from Abadan Ergal. Abadan Ergal. Yeah. Okay. Sorry, I'm a little bit slow. Not like evolution. Actually, that is like evolution. It goes really slow. For $1.99. Thank you very much. And Megan says that they also gave another $1.99. And so their question is: Did pharaohs ever murder their subjects en masse?
They certainly didn't write it down if they did. There were periods of civil war in ancient Egypt. And there were periods when fairly large groups of people were prosecuted together, right? Or, like the harem conspiracy, right? The reign of Ramses III, right? Where there were, dozens of people implicated and put to death, right? In the wake of this conspiracy. But a massive slaughter of people who were subjects of the pharaoh in Egypt, um, there's no attestation of anything like that, no.
I mean, in Mesopotamia, of course, the idea of the ruler doing anything but caring and shepherding his people is, well, I mean, that would be anathema, right? That they're striving to be the one who cares well for the people in their charge. So do you have the same sort of thing in Egypt, the same sort of concept? Okay.
Yeah, the Egyptian king is responsible for causing his people to flourish, for sort of making the gods smile in Egypt, right? And he would suppress rebels, right? The ancient Egyptian texts occasionally would refer to the suppression of rebels. But again, the idea of a mass slaughter, particularly one occasion, like a presumptive slaughter, right? Like there's always a justification for it in the text, right? The idea of some kind of um, preemptive action against Egyptian people, right? Of anybody, right? The pharaoh never initiates a conflict. He always suppresses a rebel almost, right? In terms of pharaohs campaigning abroad, right? A lot of times there was a rebellion against him in the Levant, or a rebellion against him in Nubia, right? We don't really know what it is, but it's often cast in those terms to give a reason for the pharaoh to perpetrate violence anyway, right? So the idea of a king murdering subjects is just right out.
Copy that. No, that makes sense. Let's see. Another super chat. I got a super chat from Skylar Fiction. Hey, thanks, Skylar. Appreciate you being out there for us. For $4.99. Thanks for all your support, Dr. Josh. You are a good friend. I tell you, that Dr. Josh is a little bit of a strange character. He doesn't even... he believes in evolution. And maybe if we see a dog produce a non-dog, maybe that would make sense. But so do you know... Sorry. It might be better for you if you... Do you know who Kent Hovind is?
Not really. I've heard the name.
He's he does a lot of lecturing. He taught high school science for 15 years, but he rails against evolution. He has done so for many several decades. But he has a very distinct voice, and I think I come close-ish to it, so people seem to like it. Another super chat from Michael Apple for $5. Thank you, Michael. A wonderful conversation. I need to leave early. Please do this more often. I appreciate the super chat. Perhaps if we wait long enough and we do this more often, things will evolve and get even better. Okay. Another super chat from Abaddon Nergal for $1.99. Thank you again. He says thank you. Well, thank you. It's fantastic. Another super chat, $5 from Enkidu5, and I don't see any comment, but thank you, fantastic. I really appreciate this, you guys. Sorry, it's hard. I'm reading these, from my phone, so they're not like color coded or anything. Flint Reed gives £5. Thank you, Flint Reed. Thanks again for your usual brilliant subjects and guest. Thank you, Dr. Bryson. It seems like you're really popular here. One more. And Flint Reed wants me to say water and otter. And he has a distinct way of pronouncing those words. Okay, finally, sorry. Super chat from Intellectual Iconoclasm for $5. Thank you, Intellectual. So wait, other foreigners rose to prominence without ale? Are you saying they valued merit more than dogma we claim they had? More than the dogma we claim they had? Heresy.
Well, you might have the favor of Amun. If you were the king.
All right. Well, thank you all very, very much for the super chats. Fantastic. Okay. So Eric Moyer asks, what types of Egyptian records do we have from the times where the Exodus would have happened, and how do those compare from other written records in the area?
So that's a pretty broad question.
Indeed.
Ancient Egyptians love to write things down, much as most of our friends in the Mesopotamian and Levant did as well. So we have everything from royal inscriptions, so texts that described the great deeds of pharaohs, to sort of little everyday administrative texts that would record who was working when, right? We have from the period of Ramses II, right? So our later timeline for a new kingdom exodus, we have just piles and piles of like work records, who was sick on what day from working in the Valley of the Kings, for instance, or, like I said, so like these lists of people working in weaving workshops, letters that people wrote back and forth. So we have literary texts, right? Stories that people wrote down, right? We know, but part of what we know about the Hyksos comes from a text that probably dates to the reign of, so this is Ramses II time frame, right? So this Ramessid period. That describes the quarrel between King Apophis, right, and second Enrata, right, so the period when the Hyksos were driven from Egypt. So we have a very broad range of texts from Egypt at this time, and I'll let Josh, but again, a quantification, right, if I had to give you say a number of each different type of text, I don't think we don't even have that data.
And I think part of the issue here when it comes to the Exodus is that, writing literacy, at least from the standpoint of the Israelites, it doesn't come until later, right? We don't, we have some stuff from the beginning, some early inscriptions from the beginning of the first millennium. But I mean, our written records, we don't seem to have things being written down until a little bit later in the first millennium. And so part of the issue is that you have to have this tradition. If we're going to see the Exodus happening, we have to have this tradition that lasts several centuries, which makes things more difficult, or at least complicated.
I mean, if this is something worth saying, though, right? The very simple question of if the Exodus had happened, would the Egyptians have written it down? I think it's one that's worth addressing, right? Would we even expect a record of that to have been preserved? And my argument would be that we would probably see it reflected in some way. In the documentary evidence. The Egyptians didn't like to talk about problems, right, in royal inscriptions especially, but they did. And for that matter, the idea of that many people moving around, the ancient Egyptians were very concerned with workers. They didn't like for their workers to get away. They wanted to know, like I said, we have records from Daryl Medina of who was sick on what day, right? How many days of work did you miss, right? You got in trouble, right? So if they had lost thousands of workmen all at once, I think we probably would have seen some record of it.
And we definitely,
they issued decrees, right?
Yeah, I was going to say, we one of the things that we do have is an example of a 4-room house. I think it's in Western Thebes, but
it's in Medina Habu. It probably dates to the reign of late Ramses III, Ramses IV, something like that.
So I mean, we know that no is the wrong word, but it seems like it's certainly plausible that this is what is it that they're called, proto-Israelites, that are down in Egypt during this period, and that's not a strange thing. But I think you're exactly right. If you have a group of people leaving en masse, particularly workers, as you're describing, that's probably not going to be something that's at least not spun in some way. They rebelled and we drove them out.
And the Egyptians wrote, right, they would, like, for instance, in terms of like temples, right, they would issue these temple decrees, and a lot of them seem to be aimed at controlling, and like my king, right, Horemheb, right, so a couple decades before Ramses II, right, issued a decree that seems to have to do with the control of the movement of people and goods, right. If there had been a major disruption to work, particularly if it had anything to do with keeping temples well supplied, because the ancient Egyptians would issue decrees that said, you can't hire people away from my temple lands. You can't take workers that are whose job it is to make, to produce grain and goods and things for our temple. You can't use them, right? The king is not going to steal workers away from XYZ temple project or whatever. So, they were concerned with those things, and we see them reflected. And if there had been that massive a disruption in the workforce, I would expect to see some kind of indication of it. And the ancient Egyptians were able to move thousands of people around in the desert. We have quarry inscriptions from the Middle Kingdom that talk about 20,000 people going out to get stone for the king from the Wadi Hammamat, right? And they thought of big movements of people like that as an achievement, right? They wrote it down like, wow, we got these thousands of people together, and they made a note of it, right? So I would think we'd have something.
Yeah, when you have that sort of spaceship style technology, you can do that kind of stuff. So
Helicopters.
Okay, all right. Issa K says, not a question, a message. You gave me Dr. Bryson's Skype so I could talk to her. I just finished my first Egyptology semester and wanted to thank her again for reigniting my passion.
Oh, that's wonderful. I remember your message. I'm so glad that you got back into it, that you're back on track. Like, that's terrific. I wish you every success.
These are the moments that I say, this is why we do it. This is why we do it, because
I'm going to be looking for your first book.
It's awesome. We're encouraging good scholarship. Exciting. B. Havens asks, can we also take into account that when someone is writing about something, they have parameters, things they may wish to condense or agenda they may wish to convey? This affects the story.
Sure, absolutely. Egyptian literature, Egyptian writing, right? Understanding Egyptian texts is all about understanding those parameters, understanding what the things are that the way that the ancient Egyptians thought of the world and the way they wanted to make what they wrote down kind of conform to that, right? So like the study of royal inscriptions, right? The ancient Egyptian pharaoh was a certain thing. He was the maintainer of order in a world where there was always the risk of chaos, right? So we're always aware, right, that everything is going to be adjusted, right, to sort of fit that idea of the pharaoh as the person who maintains order in the face of encroaching chaos, right? So things like that are absolutely, critical to understanding any of these texts. But again, as I said, you have to know what your range is. You have to know what's normal, right? And so even understanding that about ancient Egyptian literature, right, and sort of understanding what the range of normal variation is. What are the instances in which the Egyptians deviate from their usual on-message approach to things, right? If you have a broad enough perspective on that, you can start to kind of identify patterns and recognize, right, that those messages that we can get through them, right, to some kernel, right, at the heart of the rhetoric, in a lot of cases, not always, and also that there are times when people go off message, and those are really the interesting moments.
This is the essence of genre, right? So when we talk about, my dissertation dealt with laments, the genre of lament, and laments are a genre that, there was a developed genre from it. But the point is that you end up having a text that when you write something, you expect certain things to happen and certain things not to happen. So if you're going to tell a fairy tale today, if you write one, you're going to start it off with once upon a time, right? And when you say once upon a time, when you write once upon a time, you're cueing the listener in, hey, there's a certain type of text coming. Or if you say, welcome, thank you for buying your Toast-O-Matic 5000, be sure to send in your warranty card. Yeah, you're getting ready to read a manual, right? And so genre not only sets the standard, right? Sets what the expectation, but then when you vary from that, that's the point, right? You're breaking with the genre to make the point that you're making. So yeah, I think you're exactly right. Absolutely critical. So Abaddon Nergal adds to their question, or any actions in history perceived as bloodthirsty or tyrannical. So I think this is adding on to the slaughtering en masse. I suspect no, since pharaohs are responsible for Mot. So I think you addressed that.
Well, I mean, if we want to get at a time when an Egyptian pharaoh was sort of considered a criminal, we can go to Akhenaten. I mean, I'm sure that Dr. Josh and Megan have talked to you more than once about Akhenaten. I'm guessing he's come up.
Couple of times.
Right, and Akhenaten is our monotheist pharaoh. He comes sort of halfway between Thutmose III and Ramses II. And he is remembered as the criminal, right, of Akhenaten, his city, right? So he perpetrated some act that people perceive as unforgivable in the future, right? Or at least certain sectors perceive that way. That's certainly the official line on him. So, there is, and again, the story from Manetho, right, preserved to us through Josephus, if his reign is potentially a time when there was some kind of terrible something going on, right, lepers in the desert or whatever. But the idea of a mass slaughter is certainly not present in our documentation. I can't think of any, and again, right, there are sort of memories in the Greco-Roman period in particular of times when Egyptian pharaohs may have perpetrated injustices, right? The story of, Khufu, sort of prostituting his daughter to get stoned for the pyramids, things like that. But in the Pharaonic period, you'd have to look far. I mean, there are hints, right, of sort of tyrannical behavior, but usually, again, it has to do with the exploitation of workers as much as anything.
Makes sense. Sorry, when a new text comes in, it scrolls my text thing all the way down, so I have to scroll back up to find the last question. Okay, so John Kobu asks, since this just came up, how many people were supposed to leave Egypt in the Exodus according to the Bible and or archaeological evidence? So we talked about that. I can say one of the interpretations, again, I think it's an incorrect interpretation, but one of the interpretations is that when it says 600,000, so I would imagine it's Sheshet Alafim. So that word Aleph or Aleph, there's an argument that, well, Aleph doesn't mean thousand there, it means like a clan. And so we're just talking about, a set number of clans. No, I don't think that's, but that's one of the ways that people try to bring that number down. 600 clans, not 600,000. So, okay, Beach Price asks, are there good records of population counts in Egypt and anything that shows that there was never a great drop in numbers of people? I think we talked about that a little bit.
No, we have to extrapolate population estimates from other things. So there's not a good way to track that.
B. Havens asks, also, wasn't there an expulsion of leopards from Heliopolis that has been a suggestion of part of the Exodus? I can't for the life of me remember who wrote about that.
That would be Manetho, preserved in Josephus, the story of 𝀭Support and the lepers. I'd have to look back to, I don't remember the exact story, and I should, because it's a good story, but I don't want to tell you wrong about it, so I won't recount it. But yeah, that comes from a Hellenistic source, recounted in a Roman source, preserved mostly in medieval manuscripts. And there was a very rich tradition of literature, historical literature and historical fiction, effectively, in that period. So the story of 𝀭Support and the lepers, we think of as a kind of historical fiction that may have some kind of, again, a historical kernel, right? Like perhaps, and one of the explanations I've seen of that is that people, well, what would we be doing, right, with a population of lepers, forced into the desert? Well, they may have come across the remains of Akhenaten's city of Amarna, and noted in the very strange-looking art of that city, right, and seen, like, there's like, oh wow, we have this whole city that's full of these weird-looking pictures of people, right? Maybe they were sick, things like that, right? So that, and then in the 3rd century BC, when Manetho was writing, or in the 1st century AD when Josephus was writing, right, or sometime in that time frame, right, of the later first millennium into the current era, there may have been some memory, some experience like that, or some memory that's being transmitted through that story. But there were all kinds of stories in that period about the pharaohs of earlier Egypt and what they had done. So,
Cool.
yeah, I recommend to anybody to go look at Josephus's excerpts of Manetho. They're short, so you can read them quickly, but you can just like look in the Leb edition and sort of read the story of Asarsif. There's another good story of Harmais and Danaus. Like there's some really interesting things there. And if anybody wants information about these later stories, I can recommend some articles that talk about. Like, there's a book by Colleen Manasseh Darnell about historical fiction in ancient Egypt that would talk about the pharaonic types of this kind of literature. And then there are some articles and books by people like Kim Roholt and Richard Jasnow that talk about historical fiction in the Greco-Roman period, if you're interested.
I have some really fond memories of Dr. Jasnow. It's one of my favorite classes.
He's really terrific.
Jinxie 72 Abel. I know these names all like mean something, and I get frustrated that I don't pick up on it immediately. Weren't there places that the Israelites supposedly visited in their exodus out of Egypt that are mentioned by name in the Bible, but that didn't exist at the time? Go ahead.
Well, sure. I mean, they talk about the city of Ramses, right? Right. So that couldn't have been before, 1290 BC, 1300 BC. The story couldn't have been written down before there was a King Ramses, right? Because the Ramessid kings of Egypt had a capital city called Pi-Ramesses, right? Per-Ramesses, the house of Ramses that's in the Delta, and that's supposed to have been on that Exodus itinerary or near it. So yeah, the terminus postquem for the composition, or at least in the form we know it of that story, is there.
I think probably a really good place to look as far as the path out. Finkelstein in that volume wrote kind of giving his interpretation, his understanding of what it is that they understood about the southern desert, and tying that back to this cultural memory, in the later part of the first millennium. So that's probably a good article to take a look at. By the way, I've got the book linked in the description of this video below, I suppose, for you guys watching, and like the Amazon link. But I also put some of the bibliographic information in there. So anyway, you can get a hold of it if you like. Cortex Computer asks, "Forgive my ignorance. Didn't the Hebrew people have an exodus from Babylon? Is it at all possible that these stories were conflated at some time?" Yeah, they definitely did, right? So you have the Babylonian exile, and then they come back in the Persian period. So yeah, I mean, sorry, go ahead.
No, I'm just listening.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I mean, I don't want to say anything's possible, but I mean, these are all things that we have to factor into this context here. So yeah, I mean, that's a very good point. Sage the Owl. I was trying to pronounce Theow. So Theos maybe? It's just the space owl. Yeah, which makes sense. The translation of Red Sea instead of Reed Sea has fascinated me in how it changes the Exodus narrative. Any thoughts from the good doctor?
Oh, from which good doctor? We've got a couple of them around here.
Yes, I'm assuming you.
I wouldn't be able to speak to the Hebrew.
So it's 🀭Suf, which is like so it's not the Red Sea, it's like the Reed Sea. But it's interesting because somebody was making an argument in that volume. So Suf sounds a lot like Sof, and Sof means the end of something. So I can't remember what the argument was, but it was playing off of the word Sof. So like final letters in Hebrew are called otiot, letters, and then sophiot, final letters. So I don't remember what the argument was. But no, I don't have any good insight on the geographic distinction that we've made there, or the linguistic distinction that would be made. Sorry. Is there a sea of reeds as opposed to the Red Sea?
Well, and that would be the sort of marshy, canal landscape of the desert, the eastern delta and into the desert, I think, and the idea that they may have crossed. And there are a couple of waterways, right, seasonal waterways in the southern Negev, right, and the northern Sinai. I think it's really, but sort of in that eastern part of the Sinai. And of course, there is that marshy canal landscape with different sort of branches of the Nile that head into the southern Mediterranean. That could be a reed sea if you're talking about crossing a marshy area or a seasonal waterway in the desert in the north versus the Red Sea, right, which is to the east of Egypt, right? And there are lots of, the ancient Egyptians went to the Red Sea all the time. Throughout pharaonic history, there were what we call wadis, right? So valleys in the sort of rocky mountainous desert of eastern Egypt that they would take expeditions through to get from the Nile Valley to the Red Sea. And that was a common sort of route. And the Red Sea was a vital trade route. So, I mean, of course, the Red Sea goes all the way from the Sinai right out to its outlet into the Indian Ocean. So, there's a wide variety of, I guess, topographical possibilities. But as for the language, I don't really know.
Yeah. B. Havens, one last thought. In this part where Josh is discussing starting research with a conclusion in mind, what about the theory that Israelites are Egyptian colonists, possibly attached to the Heliopolis theory?
I'm not familiar with the Heliopolis theory.
Yeah, me either.
I think he must be talking again about that idea about lepers, right? About people being driven out of Heliopolis, or sort of leaving Heliopolis in this Josephine Menethonian narrative. And I guess the idea that they were Egyptian and not foreign anyway is a possibility. I mean, and of course, right, Egypt had a presence in the Levant, throughout a lot of the New Kingdom. So, there would certainly have been, Egyptians living and working in modern day Israel, Lebanon, Syria on the coast. But the story of Osiris, and again, I could even write a little blog post about this for you guys if you want, because I love the story. But I don't think there's any more reason, right, to attach any credibility to that perspective than to any other. Again, it's conjecture based on a literary story from, centuries after the events it describes are supposed to have happened. So, it just doesn't have a lot of meaning for me in that regard.
Understood. And that makes sense. So is there... I'm telling you, every time a new one comes through, it just goes down to the bottom. Is there any plausible connection between the Jewish Christian concept of the divine Logos and Ptah's... Is that how you pronounce that? Ptah?
Yeah, Ptah.
Okay.
Just Ptah.
Ptah's creation of his word. So that, Logos being the word of God.
You were thinking of the Memphite theology on the Shabaka stone, right? And the idea that the creator God, the Memphite creator God, Ptah, created the world by speaking, right? That it was sort of his word that initiated the process of creation. I don't see any reason why not in a shared intellectual milieu in the first millennium Mediterranean, right? Because the Shabaka stone, right, it sort of purports to preserve a much older document, but the text itself is a first millennium text, right? The object. So I don't see any reason why not, any more than that ancient Egyptian wisdom texts, right, could reappear in biblical sources, right? So this idea of like ancient Egyptian proverbs kind of coming over into biblical poetry and wisdom types of narrative. I don't at all, and of course the idea that monotheism itself, right? The idea that there is a kind of an impersonal, right? A God that's not embodied in a statue, and that is all pervasive, right? And worthy of worship, exclusive worship, is often linked. And again, Jan Assmann is your classic thinker on this, is often linked to the ancient Egyptian episode of Akhenaten's monotheism, right? His elevation of this one form of the sun god to the only god that anybody in Egypt was really supposed to deal with. And that's problematic, right? Because even as, Akhenaten and Aten definitely had a kind of one-to-one relationship. Aten was the only god for Akhenaten, but the rest of the Egyptians seem to have kind of kept doing their thing and under most circumstances. So the idea that that was a period of sort of pervasive monotheism in Egypt is probably not right. But that idea, that concept of a god with whom you would have a relationship so exclusive that it would sort of eliminate the need to worship other gods, and that god would be impersonal, right? He wouldn't be embodied in a statue. He would be everywhere, the way the Aten kind of was, is something that people link with Israelite monotheism all the time.
Nice.
How convincingly I know.
Epic Christ asks, what about the earliest alphabet that came from Egypt that had Semitic connections?
So there are texts, the date of which I am not certain of, that seem to be based. So they're based on hieroglyphs, right? There are early alphabetic types of script, or there is an early alphabetic use of hieroglyphs, but I'd have to look into that for you. I don't know enough about it to want to get into it here.
And I think this kind of goes back to what we were talking about earlier. Methodologically speaking, making sense of data points, if you had an early alphabetic script that was Semitic in origin, that, like, what that means, we have to be careful. Like, just because there is a connection between, Canaan and Egypt, I mean, that doesn't then say, oh, the Exodus happened, right? I mean, we all agree. We all agree that those connections are there and had been there for centuries, right? I mean, so I guess we've got to be careful about what that would mean. Intellectual Iconoclasm asks, should we expect to see inscriptions claiming that they attempted or did resolve the worker shortage? Oh, if there was an Exodus.
I see what you mean. Possibly, but I would expect it more to be reflected in a sudden proliferation of texts saying, don't move people around, you can't take my workers, sort of indications that they were having to administratively resolve a crisis of labor of some kind. And again, we have, like I said, sort of, Semitic names in documents that just span the entirety of the Bronze Age, right? There's no drop off at any point in that. There's no pickup in it. There's no point where we suddenly have only Egyptian names, right? Like, and again, like I said, you'll have a period, a document that sort of shows workers with Semitic names in a particular place, like a weaving workshop. And then after that, their descendants seem to become Egyptianized and we lose track of them. But that's a process that's repeated over and over again throughout Egyptian history. It's not something that happens once and then goes away. So if there were something, I would say it would have to be in the form of like decrees trying to control workforces and things like that. Or again, some statement of rebellion, some statement of, the pharaoh having taken some decisive action to correct a crisis, which happened. If there was, like there's a, like the flood stela or the restoration stela of Tutankhamun, where the pharaoh, sort of makes this statement: there was a problem and I fixed it. We call them Königsnovellen, king's novels or novellas. But I wouldn't necessarily think there would be a very direct, a direct source that we could use for that.
No, that makes sense. Vesta Freya says, Digital Hammurabi, I've got a Bachelor of Science in Psychology with a minor in Biochemistry, a Bachelor of Science and a Master's in Computer Science, and a PhD in Computer Science and Engineering. Whew. Thank you for reigniting my passion in ancient history. That's amazing.
You guys do a pretty good job.
Well, it's because we have people like you coming in here. I think this might be from Megan. So does Dr. Bryson know when camels were domesticated in this area?
Off the top of my head, no. No, I'd have to get back to you on that one.
I think it was during the Johnson administration.
But it was late.
That's my lame. Anytime I don't know something chronological, that's my lame thing that
No,
I say.
I need to look into that.
So JB says from Twitter, if you have a chance, can you ask Dr. Bryson about the Expedition Unknown live Egypt show? They are opening a sarcophagus live on air.
I love Expedition Unknown. I confess. I love watching Josh Gates go places. It's just something I enjoy. And I guess Dr. Zahi is going to be with him for that. I think it would be fun to watch just because, I mean, talk about personalities, you know, I mean, you can't go wrong watching Dr. Zahi. He'll come up with something to say. But I wonder about those things, right? Because why do we want to be there when someone opens up a sarcophagus? Why do we want to be there when someone opens up a tomb, right? What do we gain from being there for that moment of thrill?
Acid being sprayed on you, right? Isn't that what we saw in The Mummy?
No. It's more subtle, right? You don't realize you've been cursed until a couple of weeks later.
Damn.
But yeah, I would say tune in and enjoy it, right? They're going to do it anyway, so you might as well be there with them and have some fun. And you know, I've actually, you know, been around in Egypt when they've been doing things like that, and I don't think it really. I mean, I question why we do that, apart from just the desire to share the joy of experience, of novelty, of being the first ones to see something really cool. You know, I have mixed feelings about it because you always prefer, right, for there not to be anything that can go wrong when you're doing something like handling fragile antiquities. And a lot of things can go wrong when you've got camera crews around, you know, just people tripping over cords. But they're pros at this. They know what they're doing. And I think, you know, they're wanting to share that with the world, you know, for the benefit of getting people's passions excited, for the benefit of, you know, encouraging people to come and visit Egypt even, right, is, you know, it's fair.
Is this show anything like Stephen Colbert's Mysteries of the Ancient Unknown? I'm kidding.
The time that they went searching for King Tutankhamun's member, was that?
When he did that one about ancient jokes, you know, the Akkadian tablet that has jokes, he said, Cain, Abel said to Cain, your mama's so fat, she doesn't wear a fig leaf, she wears a fig tree. And then everybody laughed, and he said, and Cain did slay his brother. Oh, God. Yeah. Okay. That's not actually in the text, people, so. We can infer it, though, I think. Korag Nightwolf asks, were the Egyptians the first people who not only had men and women wearing makeup, but the pharaohs as well?
I don't know if they were the first, because wearing makeup makes a lot of sense in the ancient Near East. People, you know, it's sort of like the same way that you put paint on your face if you're going to be playing football, right? To kind of keep the glare of the sun out of your eyes. Eye makeup can help kind of discourage insects. So, you know, there are those reasons, plus which, right, just the aesthetic value of it. The idea that makeup, or that even, you know, sort of being more beautiful is something that's gendered is relatively modern, I think, right? The idea that manliness is associated with a very spare aesthetic and femininity is associated with bright colors and, you know, sort of careful management of the way that things look is pretty new. I mean, look at the 18th century, right? You know, sort of Louis XIV and his giant wigs and wasp-waisted jackets and high heels, you know, and these are beautiful, brightly colored textiles and flowers everywhere, you know, and men wore makeup then too. So I don't know that they're the first, and they're certainly not the last, but it's definitely an important characteristic of ancient Egyptian sort of personal aesthetics, that everybody was trying to look their best, and that makeup was part of that. And again, makeup, eye paint has religious connotations in ancient Egypt too, right? Applying eye paint is something that shows up in the pyramid texts, right? For like the god Horus and his eyes and the paints that are applied to them have religious significance. So it's important on a lot of levels for the ancient Egyptians.
Yeah, and we definitely see it in, like we've read here on the Digital Hammurabi book club, we read about Lugal Banda painting the Anzu chick up, you know, with coal on the eyes, and you know, you see that also in, you know, Inanna does that sort of thing an awful lot. So, yeah.
Like those early Sumerian worshiper figurines, even going as back as far as like the Brock eye idols, right? Like you wonder if that doesn't reflect the use of eye paint to some extent, like putting emphasis on the eyes. And
Yeah, I've never thought of that. Those eye statuettes are a little freaky.
Oh, and those old, like the Sumerian worshiper statues with their great
Mm-hmm.
big sort of lined
Mm-hmm.
eyes. Men sort of.
Yeah. All right, we're getting close. Thank you for sticking with us, Dr. Bryson. I
I
appreciate it.
enjoy it. I love talking to you guys.
Intellectual iconoclasm asks, and I think the questions that I have now are probably the only ones we'll be able to get through. We got four more, so thank you all very much. I think we'll get through most all of the questions. Um, is it possible that quote the sea turned red with the blood of the dashed and drowned end quote was mistranslated into the Red Sea?
I don't think it's necessary. I don't know, Josh, you might have more to say about this being the biblical scholar here to some extent, but I mean, you're better at that than I am. But I don't think it's necessary, right? I think the idea of that as an expression of a slaughter is perfectly realistic. And the idea of, so bloody liquid, just to kind of get back to that, there's a famous story about the goddess Sekhmet, right, who sets out to destroy the world. And she has to be pacified with beer that they color red to mimic blood. Right? They trick her into thinking she's going to be lapping up pools of the blood of her enemies, and it's just beer. And so she gets drunk and falls asleep, or settles down at least. And so I just imagine her passing, big lion passed out drunk, just after a good time. So I don't think it's necessary for it to be some kind of allusion to the Red Sea.
Nice. So Megan sent me another one. Thank you, sweetheart. Stardust mirror. That's okay. We can get that one too. Were climatic conditions different in the period of Egypt you are talking about?
Different from how they are now?
I guess maybe unique during that period.
I wouldn't say unique. I think that by this period, the climate of Egypt, we think of it as being similar to what it is now. The courses of the Nile were different, right? So the Nile River that we know today wasn't the same Nile River that the ancient Egyptians knew precisely, right? Its course has shifted a good bit over the years. And branches of the Nile have silted up and things like that. And there were periods in Egyptian history when there were sort of significant moments of climate change, right? The first intermediate period is usually thought of as like the fall of the Old Kingdom is usually thought to have been associated with the desiccation of the climate, right? Things got drier, and so life was harder. But Egypt's climate isn't thought to have been measurably different, I guess, significantly different then from what it is now. There is an idea that the volcano, the eruption of the 𝀭RA volcano took place sometime during Egypt's New Kingdom period, precisely when we can't say, although dating the 𝀭RA eruption is a huge hobby of a lot, or hobby, it's a thing that people do, and they argue a lot about. And that may have had a temporary impact on the climate.
And there are several articles in that book that we keep referencing that talk about the 𝀭RA volcano and people trying to use it and people arguing against trying to use it and trying to date it. So more information on that, you can definitely see it. All right. Enkidu5 asks, could Dr. Bryson explain what she knows about Egyptian control of the Levant before and after the period of the Exodus?
Wow.
Something, a nice, small, easy question there.
That would take more time than I've got here per se. The short version is that it's a period of increasingly direct control of the Levant. So in the periods leading up to the New Kingdom, right? So the earlier part of the New Kingdom, Egypt didn't have what we would consider an imperial presence in the Levant per se. I think that the first time that we might start to see some of that, right, with the garrisoning of troops over the long term in the interior Levant would have been under Thutmose III, if I'm not mistaken. So, and by the Ramesside period, right, it's really the reign of Ramses II and Seti I and Ramses II and moving forward that we see sort of extensive garrisoning and the building of Egyptian style architectural installments and the sort of permanent presence of Egyptian officials in the Levant. So it's a period of evolution in the way that Egypt sort of deals with that area. And certainly we see in the Amarna period, right, Egyptian vassal states in the Levant, so in southern Levant into the northern Levant, being the sort of main way that the Egyptians seem to have maintained control over that region, apart from when things got really bad and they had to send troops out there to kind of engage with either sort of what they would describe it, right, as quelling rebellions, right, sort of putting rebellious vassals back in their place, or to engage either directly or indirectly with, say, like the growing Hittite threat in that period, right? Because this is the period when the Hittite Empire emerges as a competitor to Egypt in that region. So that's the outline. There's a great book by Ellen Morris called The Architecture of Imperialism that talks about this issue. It's a big, thick, long book, but if you want a really detailed sort of account of the evidence, I'd recommend going there.
Fantastic. Thank you. I think that was an excellent summary. Jinxie72 Abel, are there any Egyptian records of a series of plagues?
Sure. They're not Egyptian records. There is a Hittite emperor, king, I call him emperor, right? I like the Hittites. There was a Hittite king named Mursili III in the, I guess, late 14th, early 13th century BC, who wrote a series of prayers that seem to be addressing the presence of plague. And there is a lot of sort of circumstantial evidence that Egypt was suffering from a series of outbreaks of plague late in the reign of Amenhotep III through the Amarna period. And again, this is something when we get back to that idea of a historical kernel in this Manethonian leper account, right? The Egyptians were sick a lot back then. In fact, people often sort of bring up, not again on the basis of direct evidence, but on the basis of both the fact that we know that there were episodes of plague among Egypt's neighbors in this period, the fact that so we have like the cemetery at Amarna, right? People were sick. They didn't live very long. They weren't very well nourished. The everyday people of Amarna, for instance. And then under Amenhotep III, there is this explosion in these beautiful black granodiorite statues of the goddess Sekhmet, who was a goddess that could, among other things, ward off plague. So some people have suggested that his being so aggressive and dedicating this giant set of statues to that goddess indicates that there was an episode of plague in his reign. But we're talking here about a period that covers several decades, and that is in between our two historical Exodus dates, sort of in our classical model of either Thutmose III or Ramses II as the kind of reign during which the Exodus would have happened.
Excellent. All right, last one. You've been amazing. Thank you very much, Dr. Bryson. I appreciate it. Yeah. Devil's Advocate asks, what and when is the earliest archaeological reference to Egypt?
The first time, so the Egyptian word for Egypt was Kemet, which means the black land. They would also call it Ta Meri, the beloved land. They would call it the two lands. And I don't know when the first time the word Kemet as a designation for the country of Egypt shows up. So I could look into that for you. But the idea that Egypt was a unified polity, a unified state, I mean, I guess we would say that goes back to around 3000 BC when the first dynasty begins, right? And the two lands are unified. But, it depends on which word for Egypt you're asking about too, right? Josh might be able to tell you more about like Akkadian and Semitic, like the Mizri as a word for Egypt in Semitic languages. But
yeah, I'd have to look into it as well. It's not a question you expect to be have posed to you. No, I'll give it a think. Well, I think this has been fantastic, and I know that this is a controversial issue for both scholars in the field who are trying to work out the nuances of how to interpret the data that we have, but also for people that are coming at this perhaps from a primarily religious standpoint, and I think unnecessarily believe that if what they consider to be the historical inerrant depiction of the Exodus event in the biblical text, if that is somehow shown to be not historically reliable in that sense, or accurate, and that they have to think differently about it, that would somehow bring complete destruction to their faith. I don't think that's a necessary. I don't think I think that's a non sequitur. I don't think that actually follows. And so, but I appreciate you coming and dealing with these difficult questions and trying to help us get a better grasp of what Egyptologists in the field in general think about this issue, what maybe their approaches have been to it, and maybe ways that we, as we've even seen in this chat or in this stream, what we can do to influence people to try to get into the field, to maybe take a step to bring about some even further clarity in some of these issues in the future. So thank you very much, Dr. Bryson. I appreciate you.
You're very welcome. Thank you for having me. I always enjoy talking to you guys. Tell Megan hi for me.
I definitely will. I am going to say quickly before we go that Megan has she's updated the website, so it has some things that I don't know about in it. But one of them is she has created a new Patreon. The Digital Hammurabi Patreon now is now called HAPS. So it's strictly for the HAPS scholarship. So if you want to donate to the HAPS scholarship, which we still need obviously people to continue to do, please, that's where you can donate to it. But as you can see, for those of you that are watching, Dr. Bryson's screen has been flicking kind of in and out, and she's saying amazing things, so probably you don't notice it as much because you're so fixated on the amazing things that she's saying. But if you want us to try to get better equipment, or like a better camera or a better microphone or a computer dedicated, something that we can dedicate to streaming, you can donate to us on the Digital Hammurabi Patreon. That's now available. I'm sure Megan will be talking about that the next time that she comes on, but I just want to make everybody aware of that going forward. So thank you again, Dr. Bryson, for coming on. And just to take us out, I always want to end with please resist poor scholarship. Always ask, how do you know that? Thanks, guys.